Morning, Clementine, everyone. Hope you're having a good day. We are having a nice day, not rain, not a lot of sunshine, kind of overcast, but pleasant and good here. Tell me how things are where you are today. We are almost done in our little mini series on a guy named Gideon. He was just an insignificant guy when we picked up the story in Judges chapter 6 about 12 lessons ago. We're almost done. We have one more lesson next week, and then we'll do a couple other lessons, and then we're going to take a little bit of a break for 1 week. But he's a guy that started well. God called him from a very unusual circumstances. He was just an insignificant son among many sons, but of an insignificant family from an insignificant town. And God called him to do something very, very significant, and that was to deliver the Israelites from the hands of the Midianites. The Midianites were a people that lived to the east of them, who God had sent in response to the Israelites' sin. He sent them, these people who overran their country and really took advantage of them, misused them, abused them for a period of, I think it's about 7 years. They would steal all of their crops when it came harvest time, and I don't know, what all went on. Gideon had some struggles in his faith early on, but he was committed to following God. And so after confirming that it really was God speaking to him, this is really what God wanted him to do, he obeyed and he went out and did what the Lord asked in a very unusual way. You can go back if you haven't seen that part and review from earlier lessons. But he had to do it in a way that it was clear that it was God who was providing the victory in this military campaign. So Gideon had a good start, and it's good to have a good start. He didn't seem to have a good finish. Better to have a good finish than it is a good start, but it's better to have a good start and a good finish. But the writer of the book of Judges, who was recording history, is going to basically wrap up the last 40 years of Gideon's life in about 5 verses for us. And it raises some questions, shall we say. Let's take a look at it. Judges chapter 8. Thus Midian, the Midianites who had been attacking them, were subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. So Midian never recovered and never threatened Israel again. And during Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. That's the good news of what God was promising through Gideon. 40 years of peace. And presumably 40 years of the Israelites around him um, committing themselves to following the true and living God by faith and obeying him. We're going to see how things change afterwards, but this is the last 40 years of his life. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, that is his other name uh, that Gideon got way back at the beginning of his story when he cut down the statue and the Asherah pole, and the townspeople were mad, and they gave him. This is the Baal or Baal is a foreign god, a foreign made-up god that the people of Israel were following. And they gave him this name to kind of taunt him at the time, but Joash took it on as kind of like a badge of honor. It says that he went back home to live his life, and he had 70 sons of his own. Wow, you say that is a lot of sons. One woman could not possibly have provided him with 70 sons. And you would be correct if you thought that. It says, for he had many wives. It doesn't even tell us how many. He also had a concubine. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son whose name was Abimelech. Now, let's stop for a second. One of the things you have to understand when you're reading the Old Testament is the times were different and there were practices and things that were very different than the way it is today. Excuse me. I almost have a cough here this morning. This idea of having many wives is something that God seemed to have tolerated, but it was not God's will for them. God made it very clear from the time of Adam and Eve, the very first people that the Creator put on this earth, that his desire was for one man to marry one woman. Biological man, sorry I have to say that these days, biological woman, married together for a lifetime, committed to each other exclusively, to have children within that and to raise children within that framework. But the human heart being what it is, we have corrupted that and in a lot of ways, and so things don't go according to God's plan. Now, it's curious to me why God doesn't outright condemn polygamy in the Old Testament. Like many of our heroes of the Old Testament had multiple wives. Abraham had multiple wives. David had multiple wives. Solomon had multiple wives. Having multiple wives was often a sign of both power and prosperity. You needed money to afford multiple wives. It was difficult enough to be able to support one wife and family back in the day. Joash, I don't know why I said Joash, um, Gideon, in the course of carrying out God's will for him, became an exceedingly rich man. I'm not faulting for that. Became an exceedingly rich man and a powerful man. And as was common to the people of that day, it was almost expected of them that they would go out and do this, but it was not God's will. God's will, as I said, that Jesus affirmed in the New Testament, that the rest of scriptures affirm, was that one man was supposed to go out and marry one woman and have a lifetime together raising children. Now, I realize life doesn't always work out like that. I myself grew up in a home where two parents did not stay together throughout our childhood. I understand this stuff happens, but it doesn't erase, I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, but it doesn't erase what God's goal was for that. Ultimately, this did not work out well. So he has a number of wives. We don't know how many. I don't know how many wives it would take to make 70 sons. I mean, that is just a ridiculously big family. And in addition to the 70 sons, he then has a concubine. A concubine is it's almost like a girlfriend on the side, but they have a legal, I don't want to say marriage, they have an illegal agreement where he treats her as a wife, but she continues to live with her family. So in this case, this concubine, not quite a wife, more than a girlfriend on the side, has a formal agreement, bears him a son named Abimelech over in the town of Shechem. That's not the town where he was living. This was not a good thing. We're not going to necessarily look at the story, but I would encourage you to read Judges chapter 9. Maybe we'll cover that next week. I don't know. Where we see how Abimelech acts in the future. In fact, maybe we will. That's how we'll wrap up the series. We'll briefly look at Judges chapter 9 and see what this son of a concubine did. But all I'm saying is God has explained to us how to live life. For whatever reason, well, because of our sin nature, we often think we know better. So we try to normalize things that God would consider sin or that things that God would say that's not according to my plan. It never works out well in the long run. Abimelech ends up being a very big problem. Having 70 sons and multiple wives is a problem. This was not necessarily a good thing, but for whatever reason, God did not condemn him. And God, it says that God allowed Gideon to die at a good old age. He lived a full life, and he was buried in the tomb of his father in his hometown where he grew up. And that's how the story of Judges chooses to wrap up Gideon's life, a man who had been committed to God by faith, obeying God, doing a great thing for God. But like any heroes or people we look up to, they're not perfect. They have feet of clay. And if you look hard enough, you're going to find something that disappoints you. Gideon was also very human and, uh, in one sense, did not finish life well. And it's going to come back to bite him. But that's a story for another day. The encouragement here today is that trust what God says for you to do and the way God says for you to live, because that is where God blesses. Anytime we choose to step out of that, God may condemn it. God will ultimately condemn it. He may choose to make that evident right away. He may choose to delay in making that evident that you stepped outside of his will and his plan. But within his will and within his plan, that is the place of God's blessing. And so that ultimately is today's lesson, at least as I read this story for us today. Gideon, a man who started well, but didn't necessarily finish well. Anyway, Lord willing, I hope to see you all on Monday as we have a couple final lessons next week. And I hope you have a good weekend between now and then.